The goal of this video is to talk about how children acquire language or how children learn language. So we're going to learn about two theories, the nature theory, which is Noam Chomsky's theory, versus the Skinnerian view or the behavioral view, the nurture view, meaning that language is learned, as opposed to being innate, which was popularized by the one and only B.F. Skinner, which you remember from our learning unit when we learned about operant conditioning. So we're going to talk about the nature approach and then this nurture approach. So this idea that we're hardwired to learn language versus language is something that's completely learned via reinforcement. So the innateness theory of language is the idea that we all have an inborn ability to learn vocabulary and grammar. Chomsky's theory is that we are born with these structures in our brain that are programmed with the fundamental rules of grammar, or we are programmed to understand the fundamental rules of grammar due to these structures being present in our brain. He calls this the language acquisition device, or the LAD. So this means that, again, we're hardwired to understand and to develop our ability to use grammar. I want you to think about these questions. Which hemisphere specializes in language development? Which two parts of the cerebral cortex that we've learned about are involved in speech production and comprehension? So pause the video for 1 second and see if you can remember that information. Hopefully you recall Broca's area and Wernicke's area. If you remember, Broca's area is located in the frontal lobe. In the vast majority of people, the left hemisphere is responsible for language functions. So remember, just left language. So Broca's area is located in the frontal lobe, and it's responsible for speech production. Wernicke's area is located in the temporal lobe, again, in the vast majority of people in the left hemisphere. So when an individual is listening to another person speak, that information comes in through the auditory canal, remember transduction, all that blah, 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 to the temporal lobe. I'm able to hear and I'm able to understand them thanks to Wernicke's area. Now I want to be able to produce speech in response to them, so that information gets sent to Broca's area, to the motor cortex, which enables me to move my mouth in formations that are required in order for me to actually speak, in order for me to produce speech. Remember that aphasia is an inability to use language, or some kind of inability to speak, right? So Broca's aphasia is the inability to produce language, whereas Wernicke's aphasia is the inability to comprehend language. So if you remember back to Sarah, who had the stroke, and it was very effortful for her to produce language. She had Broca's aphasia, whereas I believe it's Marlon. I'm getting that wrong, I think. But the older gentleman who also had a stroke that we watched earlier in the year, he had an inability to produce speech that was comprehensible. Remember, he produced that word salad, the very jumbled speech. Really interestingly, research has shown that macaque monkeys have areas in their brain that are comparable to both Broca and Wernicke's areas, but those regions are involved in producing and understanding facial expressions of other members of their species, as opposed to actually producing and comprehending speech like we do. And we already know that, again, for most individuals, language centers are in the left hemisphere. We know this from Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzanica's research with split brain patients that we learned about back in our bio units. This is just a little bit of a review. More research has also shown that the same brain regions that are involved in producing and understanding speech are also involved in individuals who use American Sign Language. So the production of sign language and the understanding of sign language involves areas of the brain that are similar to that which we use when we are actually speaking. And this suggests that, something about language goes beyond just the ability to get the words out and to speak them. There's something about language that's so universal. It doesn't matter whether a person is using their voice or using their hands. There is something about our brain that's just wired for the ability to produce and understand language. So support for Noam Chomsky's LAD, the language acquisition device, or this innateness theory of language, is that language learning stages are similar across cultures. Stages of language stages of language development that we learn about in our next video also occur at similar ages cross-culturally. Another interesting thing is that deaf children develop language with similar sentence structure, and they begin manually babbling, meaning babbling with their hands, at the same age that hearing babies begin vocal babbling. So again, this notion that our brains are hardwired for language. Then we have Skinner and this nurture theory or nurture approach, the idea that all language is learned. So we know all about conditioning. We've studied the behaviorists since way back in Unit 1. We understand that they believe that all behavior is a product of prior consequences or prior reinforcement. So in other words, a behaviorist might say we associate sounds with objects or actions and events by imitating others, that adults reinforce correct speech in children, and that's how children learn speech. Arguments against Skinner, though, are that language we're going to learn develops so rapidly that it's not possible that it can all be learned. In other words, every word that a child speaks cannot possibly be a product of an adult intentionally reinforcing it in the past. There's also an infinite number of sentences in any language, so it can't all be learned by imitation because children are always producing combinations of words that they haven't necessarily heard before. And children also make errors that adults don't make. And my daughter, she always says, I goed somewhere. Or another example is Billy hitted me, or I braked the lamp. These are examples of what we call over-regularization or over-generalization. Overgeneralization is when children, when they're first learning how to use grammar, they will apply the rules of grammar too widely. So in other words, in a lot of scenarios, yes, when you want to express past tense, you add ed onto the end of the word, but there are other situations that aren't appropriate. Well, if this nature theory were 100% true, then that would mean that children would only reproduce language that they hear from adults, and that's not what children do. They make these grammatical errors that adults don't make, that they don't hear in adults. So again, that's just another argument against this idea that all language is a product of learning or conditioning.